Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first lecture. Today, we're going to be looking at the Renaissance and the Reformation. We're going to be looking at what led up to these two monumental events and how these two events are going to push Europe forward for the next couple hundred years as we go through the first module of this class. Now, this lecture is going to be split up into three different parts. The first part is going to be more of an overview and the origins of the Renaissance. And then we're going to be looking at the Renaissance itself. And finally, we're going to be looking at the Reformation, what led up to it, and how that plays off. Now, after the Renaissance and Reformation, you see Europe moving into the forefront of world affairs. The rest of the world begins to retreat, which we'll be looking at over the next few weeks. So, without too much ado, we will go ahead and get started with our lecture here in week one. Now, before we get too far into the Renaissance and Reformation, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the Renaissance and Reformation, and then we will get into the specifics. The Renaissance lasted basically from the 15th to the 17th century, and Renaissance itself is a word that means rebirth, and it really was a rebirth for Europe in world affairs. However, before we get into this rebirth, we need to look at some of the different misconceptions about the Renaissance. Some of the things that people sort of half think about, and some of these are not exactly true things. The first being the misconception about what came before the Renaissance. There has to be something for rebirth to happen. There needs to be basically a death, sort of like a phoenix. However, these dark ages, the medieval times, are not really what they seem to be. You know, people think of this time as an era of complete backwardness, of superstition, of witch burning, and mass hysteria. Now, there were those things. There were mass hysteria and witch burning. However, this wasn't complete backwardness. There were advances being made both in religion, in philosophy, in science, and literature. However, these different advances were happening in things like universities or in monasteries, so away from the general populace. And all of these different advances are happening in isolation, and there's no technology to really produce them out to the masses. And so all of these different accomplishments that are happening are not being dispersed out to the general public, but they are happening. Now, another misconception about the Renaissance is that it was this universal rebirth. That all of a sudden, somewhere in Europe, everybody just started getting smarter and things started happening. That's not exactly what happened. In Europe, the Renaissance begins in the Italian states and then moves out into the rest of Europe slowly but surely. Advances in the Renaissance allow it to spread a lot more quickly when you start getting into the 1500s and 1600s. And you see a lot of different advances coming through, and there's a lot of things that are going on at once. However, it's not this straight push forward progress of history thing, and there's ebbs and flows, there's advances and the retreats of the things that are being accomplished by the Renaissance. It's not all of a sudden everybody just gets smarter. And another thing about it, the universality about the Renaissance is that it's not something that Europe really shares with the rest of the world. You are seeing, as we will be discussing next time, you're seeing the retreat of some of the great places of learning in the Islamic world. You're seeing great golden age of Islam beginning to end, and then basically being swallowed up by history. So the Dark Ages were a time in Europe where things were backwards, but in Islam, in China, and even in India, you're seeing a lot of great advancements. And then once the Renaissance hits in Europe, the rest of the world is actually in retreat. So this is very, very fortunate for Europe. The final misconception is a just sort of a little nitpick. The fact that a lot of people think that it is an Italian Renaissance. Now, the Italian origins of the Renaissance are overstated simply because there was no Italy at the time. The country was not unified. It was only a collection of city states that were at war with one another, that had tentative peace with one another, and weren't really a united front. You're not going to see Italy united until the late 1800s. So that's just kind of a little nitpick and a little thing that you could, um, you know, kind of lord over people that you know that there was no Italy. The Italian states were their own governments, things like that. So, but those are the three misconceptions that I really just wanted to go over: the Dark Ages, the universality of the Renaissance, and the Italian origins of which. Now, the importance of the Renaissance. Now, this is something that is really, really common, and the most important, the most common thing that people think of when they think of Renaissance is the art. From paintings to sculptures to literature, philosophy, all of these things are happening during the Renaissance, and art is something that we really clamp onto as humans. The art style changes drastically in the Renaissance, and you start seeing a lot more focus on human beings, a lot more focus on humanity, and the bringing together the divine and the human in art. Another thing that is very important that sometimes is talked about by people is philosophy. When we're going to be looking at the Renaissance, we're going to see that it is a rebirth of old ideas. So we're looking at the rebirth of things like classical Greek philosophy. Basically, new ways of looking at humanity that were actually old ways of looking at humanity, but sort of brought up to, at that time, the modern standard. So you're seeing philosophy that had sort of been pushed off to the side is being brought back into the forefront and being mixed with Christian thought and things like that. And then finally, last but not least, is technology. The importance of technology during the Renaissance can't be overstated. You are looking and finding old methods that are being improved upon, old technology, old methods to navigate are being improved upon by new technologies, new ways of dispersing literature and theology are being created. And so these new innovations in technology are going to drive the new philosophies, drive these new innovations, and spread them throughout Europe. That's why you start seeing, even though the Italian city states begin the Renaissance, it quickly spreads out through Europe because of the technology that is devised during the Renaissance. So, art, philosophy, and technology are the three most important concepts that come out of the Renaissance. Now, as for the Reformation, a lot of people ask, "What is the Reformation?" Especially as we get further and further away from this thing, so it's not a pressing thing. A lot of what the Reformation is a religious reform movement that divided the Western Christian church into Catholic and Protestant groups. And so there was this movement to move away from the church. This movement to move away from the church, whether it be because of religious ideas in the eyes um, of Martin Luther or John Calvin, or if it was because of political beliefs in the marriages of Henry VIII. So the Reformation is basically this reform movement to move away from the Catholic Church, to divide the church, to create these new religions, to reform religion. Uh, and it ends up leading to two different uh, Christian churches, basically, and then splintered off into even more Christian churches. So, the background of the Reformation. So, a little bit of background to the Reformation. Why does this Reformation happen? We'll go more into this later on, but basically, what happens is you have the growth of state power. The Catholic Church is the power throughout the Middle Ages. It is it basically controls people's souls, their eternal souls, and so they have much more power in the world than any other king. However, leading up to the Reformation, hand in hand with the Renaissance, is this growth of state power. You have these new monarchs rising throughout the late 1300s all the way up to the late 1400s, and these new monarchs are actually looking more for a long line of succession. They're not just about themselves. They're not just about the short term thinking. These new monarchs um, are thinking about their legacies. For the longest time, uh, monarchs come and go, and they basically wage wars throughout their entire lives, and then die. And a new leader comes up that's not as great as them, and quickly the empires fall. Now, these new monarchs are looking for stability. They're looking for longevity, and they're looking for dynasties that will last a long time. These new monarchs include, here up at the top, you have Henry VII, who ends the War of the Roses and unifies all of the monarchs under the British crown. You have John I of Portugal, who unifies the many warring factions in Portugal and helps to push the Islamic forces during the Reconquista. It helps push those forces out. You also have Louis XI of France, who is able to take um, take the actions that his father began, and basically unite the forces of France together, and create France into a unified force and one of the strongest forces on the European continent. And then finally, these new monarchs, the most well known of these new monarchs are Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain are going to come in to power in in late 1492, and they're going to immediately come in, seize the power, take over Spain, and give Christopher Columbus the money that he needs to sail the ocean blue. So these new monarchs they unify their nations. They begin to grow their empires, and they begin to lay the seeds for success for future monarchs. So you have a longer line of rulers, less dynasties rising and falling, and more of a look at political power versus the military strength. So, along with these new monarchs comes the concentration of royal authority. Basically, the royal authority, with the weakening of the church, begins this idea that it is the king that commands. It is not the Pope that commands. It is the King. The Pope is in Rome. The Pope is not in the different kingdoms, and so they should not have to bow down to the Pope at every time. You start seeing this with the ends of the Crusader period. Really, the end of the Crusader period really plays into the increase of royal authority, as these kings no longer really need to listen to the Pope and go and do what the Pope says. Instead, these kings concentrate on political power and on royal authority, so that the Pope's hold over people is lessened. And As I just mentioned, there's more of a preoccupation with political power. Politics become a lot more important. Intrigue, backstabbing, all of these fun things that we all know about European monarchy actually comes through right before the Reformation. So all of these ideas of politics moving into religion really play into the reasons why you have a Reformation. You have a growth in the power of the king, a weakening of the church, and a wish for these kings to have a long succession. And one of the things that is in the way of the succession is actually the Catholic Church. And so the you have basically the right ingredients for a move away from the church. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's look at the origins of the Renaissance. Let's take a deep dive into what it is that leads Europe to be ready for a change. What exactly it is that makes it so that Europe leads to a rebirth. The first thing that we're going to be looking at, fittingly enough, is the Black Death. Here in this semester, where we are all isolated from one another, we're going to be looking at the plague, the Black Death, the uh, wrath of God upon the world itself. The Black Plague has its origins in Asia and actually comes through to Europe on the backs of the Mongols. The Mongols begin their invasions in the 13th and 14th century, and sometime throughout that, they begin to bring pestilence with them. And the Mongols are actually aware of the pestilence that they are bringing, and they actually will throw plague-ridden corpses into walled cities. So if you have you have reports along India and the Middle East of the Mongols coming in to siege a city and the people of the city walling up and the Mongols actually throwing plague infested bodies into the cities, which leads to people in there getting sick. So the Mongols knew exactly what they were doing. The Mongols knew that they were carrying a new type of death that the people of Europe were not ready for. Now, later on, as the Mongols begin to settle down, begin to trade, you're going to start seeing the plague come through more through trade routes. The plague actually, most people think that it is the rats that cause the plague. Like if you got bit by a rat, that would lead to the plague. And people at the time in Europe believed that as well. And so you would have a lot of people that would basically become rat catchers. The idea of a pest control began during this time because everyone was afraid of rats. But it actually wasn't the rats themselves that brought the plague. It was actually the fleas inside the rats that were infected with a disease known as Yersinia pestis, and this disease came in three different forms: bubonic, pneumonic, and septimic. Septimic and bubonic were the most common. They're the ones that caused the black pustules that brought along the bleeding from people. That basically was the sign that you had the black plague. Pneumonic plague was something that stayed behind. Pneumonic being the airborne version of the plague. So you would get blood. You would get infected with bubonic or septimic. It would spread through. Bodies would be lying everywhere, and then once these bodies would release gases through all of these sores, the air would be infected with even more of the plague. And so, because of this, you have a mass catastrophe in Europe. The Black Death becomes one of the most devastating natural disasters in European history. Mortality figures were incredibly high during the Black Death. you had somewhere between 30 to 60% of the entire population of Europe dying because of the Black Death. There are some estimates that the population of Europe at the time was about 475 million people at the beginning of the plague in the 1300s, and then really by within that century, within the 14th century, the population went down to about 300 to 350 million. So you had this catastrophic event. It took until about 1500 for the population of Europe to go back to the 14th century. So basically, it took 200 years for the Black Death to come through, and then for Europe to recover from it. So this is because the plague uh, attacked through so many ways. So you could get it through the fleas that would bite you, and you would get it in your blood system. You could get it from drinking contaminated water that would have the plague within it, and then after all that, it became airborne, and you could get it that way, and it would attack your lungs and basically eat you from within. So because of all of this, mortality figures were incredibly high, and many people who would catch it would basically see this as a death penalty. There was a 98% chance of dying. As I said, it took between 30 to 60% of the European population. And so the population goes down to about 400 to 350 million people throughout the world. And so this plague is seen as a punishment. Why would God let this happen? This is a punishment. Many people believed that the plague was sent by God for their sins. And so they decided that the reason why this was happening was because there were people that were sinners. There were people that had turned themselves away from God. There were people that were not following God's law, and these people were living among them. These people were Jews. And across Europe, Jews were seen as the cause of the plague. They were seen as the reason why God was angry. And so virulent anti Semitism rises throughout Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, most commonly in Germany. You have several pogroms carried out throughout the Germanic states as Jews are made scapegoats. And this won't be the last time this happens. It's a little foreshadowing for later. So, with the Black Death comes a lot of death. The Black Plague comes fear, chaos, turning against your fellow man. So Europe begins to devolve into chaos just through the sheer amount of death. Now, along with this death, then comes economic woes, because the plague causes dislocation and social upheaval. Imagine, if you will, you are a peasant living out in the countryside. You are working for someone who um, basically takes most of your crops or most of your money, and you cannot escape. All of a sudden, the town nearby goes through one of these plague events. Luckily, you live far enough away that you are not affected by this, but now the town is empty, and there's a shortage of workers in the town. And the price of labor moves up. People are looking for skilled workers. People are looking for apprentices. And a um, as a farmer, you have a lot of skills that can be used in things like in things like blacksmithing, tanning, weaving, etc., things that are needed in the cities. And so, because there's a shortage of workers, people can demand more money. And so, you have that happening. At the same time, you have a lot of less people, so there's a lower demand for food. When 50% of the population dies, then, you know, you're going to not need as much food. And so the demand for food declines, falling prices. Meanwhile, in the cities, there's a need for workers. So basically, labor costs become higher for landlords. They're not making as much money for the crops, and the workers are demanding more money, or they're going to leave. So there's a lot of declining income. And so the landlords look at the laborers. The laborers are saying, we need to be paid more, or we're going to leave. And so they begin to press the issue with laborers. And the laborers are going to say, we own the means of production. The laborers are going to say, we are the ones that control what is happening, who's making the food. We are. You're not going to get down here and work. And so the landlords are going to press the issue, and the laborers are going to say, fine, we're going to move. And they're going to leave. And they're going to move into cities, and they're going to actually show that they have some sort of power. This is one of the first times that you see peasants actually showing their power. And so the laborers are going to move to cities. You're going to see cities begin to grow again. You're going to see cities begin to fill back up, and the countryside is going to be the is going to basically stable out. As laborers move to cities, they're the most devastated areas. They're going to be able to find good, honest work, and the landlords are going to be basically to um, pressed to figure out a way to make money. And basically, the early laborers that move to cities sometimes get an extra dose of the plague as it continues through for the next 100 years. But those that survive actually begin to make a lot more money, especially if they get into trade, especially if they become merchants or start working with merchants. Those are in the merchant class. That's where the money is going to be. The laborers are going to be able to move and basically become more of a middle class. Now, the landlords in the countryside are going to then begin to get together with the landlords in the cities, and they're going to basically say, well, we need to make more money. And so they begin to stifle and basically collude with one another, and the prices are artificially moved low. So the wages are artificially moved low. So the landlords in the cities and the landlords in the countryside, basically rich people, get together and begin to push against the rising working class, and then they begin to stifle any sort of dissent. The establishment classes um, basically manipulate the market, manipulate the land value and the value of work, and then they have the workers basically artificially having to um, take pay cuts um, for any sort of work that they do. And so this basically keeps them in a permanent underclass, either saying, hey, if you want to make very little money, go out to the countryside. Oh, if you want to make just a tiny bit more money, move to the city. There's really no winning for the lower class. But those that were able to escape beforehand are able to begin to make more money and create this new middle, I don't want to say middle class because it's not really middle class, but it's more of it's the merchant class that begins to have a little bit more money. So you have the devastation caused by the Black Plague. You have all of these changing economic relationships throughout Europe. And so it's only fitting that now we move to politics. And back in this time, basically politics meant war, specifically the Hundred Years' War, which lasted from 1337 to 1453, which by my admittedly faulty math is just a smidge outside of 100 years. They were close. Historians were a little close in uh, naming this long and drawn out conflict. So the Hundred Years' War has its beginning in 1337, where England declares war on France over the um, over the right to rule Scotland, Gascony, and Flanders, and the ruling of these areas also leads to being in line for the French throne. And these issues had been simmering since the Norman conquest. So basically, you have 300 years of intrigue, of political moves being set up, of actual battles from over the right to rule in either England or France. And this all comes to a head in 1337. And from 1337 to 1453, you have the longest conflict between two warring states that Europe has seen at the time, and really the longest one that we will ever see at the time. During this conflict, during the Hundred Years' War, one of the things that you see is that the cannon is first used. Um, Gunpowder and guns come from Asia into Europe through what we'll be looking at next time, which are known as the Gunpowder Kingdom. So basically, the intermediaries between Asia and Europe here in the Islamic world begin to sell weapons to France and to England, and they begin to be used for the first time here in this conflict. So you're starting to see modern weaponry, modern warfare begin to take shape. Of course, fittingly enough, it is between England and France when it comes uh, to European affairs. And so, with this Hundred Years' War comes the end of a lot of dynasties in both England and France. By the end of the Hundred Years' War, you will see the beginning of the War of the Roses in England, and in France, you will begin to see the rise of, as I said, Louis the XI, Henri the Seventh before him, and then Louis the XI. So it really changes the makeup of the ruling nobility in both England and France, which in turn then affects the rest of Europe. And so at the end of the Hundred Years' War, basically, France is able to kick England out. This war is really seen in three different phases. The first phase, England has a stronghold on France, has a lot of allies in the French mainland, but slowly but and surely England is pushed back throughout, where by the end, basically a small land in Flanders, in what is now Belgium, is all that England really has a claim on. And so England loses its hold on the continent. England no longer has real holdings on the continent of Europe, and you start seeing this English exit. I don't know if there's a way to say that, very a catchy way of saying that, but this English exit away from the European mainland, and England then has this sort of uh, outsider attitude towards towards the mainland of Europe. They are a part of the continent, but not really a part of the continent. They are still sort of in the European affairs, but also separate European affairs, and that's going to last, basically up until now. So, like I said, this leads to a lot of political disintegration within Europe. You see feudal order beginning to break down. As I talked about at the beginning, the new monarch begins to take control, and the feudal order, basically gave more of the power uh, the the barons, basically the nobility, uh, had all the power because they controlled the money and they controlled the troops. However, with the strengthening of the monarchs, the kings begin to take power away from the nobility, from the dukes, barons, counts, etc., and they begin to solidify military under the monarch, which then breaks down feudal power and basically makes the nobility much less powerful. And this is going to play into this is another one of those foreshadowing moments as the nobility begins to resent the power of the monarch. You also see the rise of new dynasties, as I spoke about earlier, the rise of the new monarchs, and you also see these new dynasties fighting for their position by having to take drastic measures, having to claw their way. In France, you see someone like Joan of Arc, pictured here, basically be a champion of the people, and she becomes a threat to the power structure, and so she is quickly accused of witchcraft and heresy, and she is burnt at the stake because she is seen as as a way as a person that is going to further damage the order of things. The monarchs are okay with sort of breaking away other people's power, but if you try to take their power, they will do whatever it takes to eliminate any threats to them. And so, with this political disintegration, with all of this war, comes financial problems. As we talked about, the economic base is shaky. The peasants are looking to get more money. There's a new rising merchant class. And so, at the top, financial problems are going um, to continue to plague these new monarchs. And one of the entities, excuse me, that really feels this um, financial strain is the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church continues to play the monarchs off one another and continues to try and figure out, who's going to be the best monarch to put their weight behind. And in the beginnings of the Hundred Years' War, they're definitely on the side of the French, and they shift throughout conflicts. You see the church beginning to switch positions. The church is a lot more concerned with money, with power, with continuing to maintain their hold on earthly possessions. And so this leads to a lot of issues within the church. And one of the things that happens most of all is that the supremacy of the Pope is challenged. The monarchs, these new monarchs especially, are saying that they're no longer willing to accept the papal claims of what is known as temporal supremacy, or the supremacy of your human body. The Pope can claim its supremacy on a person's soul, but as far as earthly affairs, that is up to the monarch, and the monarchs begin to push back as early as the 1300s. And this leads to the popes pushing back against, especially against the French crown. And so eventually in 1377, the French just say, well, we're going to have our own pope. We do not acknowledge the authority of the Roman Pope, and so the French will basically have their own pope. In 1377, what is known as the Great Schism or the Great Western Schism. There's a couple of great schisms, but this is the Great Schism of 1377. The Western Schism divides the church in Europe. So you have the Roman Pope and you have the French Pope. You have the basically what is known as the Pope and Anti-Pope. And if the anti-pope and pope were to ever meet, the entire universe would explode. That's a joke for all of you science majors there. So this basically, for about 100 years, you have the existence of two different popes, one in Rome and the other one in France, in Avignon, France. And so at one point, even there's three popes. So things get crazy at some point. But basically, by like around 1450, everybody comes back together, especially with the end of the Hundred Years' War, and the Pope sort of has to uh, basically the papacy then becomes undermined. The with the end of the Hundred Years' War, with France being in control of the continent, the papacy then is undermined, and the church loses much of its power and a lot of prestige. So they don't have a lot of prestige. That they don't have a lot of power over the monarchs. So you have the Catholic Church lessened, but what they do have is money. And that's going to be very important. So, what we have here at this chaotic time period before the rise of before the beginnings of the Renaissance is you have health issues. You have the death of millions in Europe. You have economic issues. You have the changes in the way that people see themselves, and people see their worth as far as labor goes. You have political upheavals with the new monarchs saying that they are in charge of their own countries, consolidating power, thinking long term, and basically telling the church that the church has no power over them. And then the Catholic Church pushes back, ultimately loses, and so the papacy is weakened. The church itself is weakened, and with all these four factors, the economic, health, political, and religious issues, you start seeing the world being ripe for change, and that is exactly what happens. We'll come right back to this after this little break.